Good afternoon. I'm Elizabeth Cropper, Dean of the Center for Advanced Study in the Visual Arts at the National Gallery of Art. And on behalf of the Board of Trustees, I want to welcome you all to this afternoon's lecture. The occasion is a very special one for us, for it marks a new development in the Center's long-standing relationship with the Wyeth family and the foundations that they have established to further the understanding, preservation, and appreciation of American art. In 1987, a group of scholars advised the Wyeths that a fellowship at the Center in Andrew and Betsy Wyeth's name might become the predoctoral fellowship in American art in the United States. The fellowship was to be open to students from all over the world if they were involved in American graduate programs. And after some discussion about the character of the art to be studied, there was a complete understanding on the part of the Board of Advisors that the critical factor in the choice of fellows was above all to be quality. Over the years, we've had a series of remarkable Wyeth Fellows who spend 1 year in the field and 1 year with us, some of whom, I'm happy to say, are here tonight, and several of whom have gone on to important curatorial and academic positions. 2 years ago, with the support of the endowment, the CASVA put together a symposium on the 18th of October 2001, in which a group of the most prominent younger scholars, many of whom had been Wyeth Fellows here at the gallery, presented their new work. This event, which took place at a critical moment in our nation's history, turned out to be the launching pad for a new set of proposals to the Wyeth Foundation, intended to strengthen our commitment to scholarship on American art at the gallery and at CASVA. And we've been given the very welcome assurance by the Wyeth Foundation that in the future, a day-long seminar such as that held so successfully 2 years ago, and a distinguished lecture, the first of which will be delivered tonight, should alternate annually at the gallery. In this way, we intend to continue to provide leadership in the study of American art and also to be a catalyst for the many research efforts that are underway in this city and which might otherwise go unnoticed. We have many distinguished colleagues from around the mall here today, and I want to welcome them all as partners in this effort. I also just want to add that I think none of this would have come about without the support of John Wilmerding, who unfortunately could not be here today, of the Foundation and, of course, of the National Gallery, who will be speaking here on Sunday about his latest work. With his support and that of members of the board of the Wyeth Foundation, we hope to encourage this field to prosper. And so finally, I come to tonight's lecturer. I think that when the possibility of an inaugural Wyeth lecture came to us, Deans Teresa O'Malley, Peter Lukart, and I had no doubt that this lecture would have to be given by Jules Prown. Professor Prown has been a generous teacher, an innovative scholar, and a visionary leader in this field. Many of his former students, undergraduate and graduate, and former colleagues are also here tonight. After graduating from Lafayette College and Harvard University, he studied at the University of Delaware for the master's and then Harvard for the PhD degree. Jules Prown has held many positions at university museums, having served as assistant to the director of the FOG, curator of Garvin and related collections of American art at Yale, and especially, of course, as director of the Yale Center for British Art from 1968 to 1976, and even as interim director of the Yale University Art Gallery. He was also a professor in the department at Yale, moving from assistant professor in 1961 to Paul Mellon Professor of the History of Art, 1986 to 99, and he's currently Paul Mellon Professor Emeritus of the History of Art at Yale. Jules Prown has been an extraordinary university citizen, as he has been of numerous national institutions, from the Paul Mellon Center for Studies in British Art to the Archives of American Art, the Board of Directors of the College Art Association, the editorial board of the Winterthur Portfolio, and of the Art Bulletin. And he's received the Distinguished Teaching of Art History Award of the College Art Association. You'll notice that so far I haven't even mentioned Jules Prown's publications, on Copley above all, but also on Trumbull, Akins, Homer, and West, and many others, and his contributions to the often disputed territory between the history of art and the history of material culture, a topic a small group will discuss tomorrow in our seminar on Watson and the Shark. The Center for Advanced Study in the Visual Arts is committed to new scholarship and to publication. We're also, however, deeply committed to making sure that the best traditions of scholarship and of scholarly comportment and civilization are passed on to a new generation. Jules Prown is a wonderful example of such a life of scholarship and engagement, and we're deeply grateful to the Wyeth for making it possible to invite him here tonight in such auspicious circumstances. Please welcome Jules Prown, our inaugural Wyeth Lecturer. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Dean Cropper, for a very generous introduction. I'm very honored to be here and to be the first speaker in this series. I'm going to discuss this afternoon 5 American painters. Here are Gilbert Stuart, John Trumbull, Charles Willson Peale, Benjamin West, and John Singleton Copley. Copley and West were born in 1738, Peale 2.5 years later. Stuart and Trumbull were almost of the next generation, born in 1755 and 56 respectively. Their paths crossed and recrossed throughout their uniformly long lives. They formed friendships, influenced each other both through their art and personally, competed for clients, and eventually drifted apart, or in the case of Copley and West, became bitter enemies. The lecture will focus on their personal and professional encounters and interactions to tell the story of how they affected each other's art and lives. The 2 artists most central to the story are Copley and West, whose long careers were intertwined from beginning to end. Copley was born in Boston in early July 1738. His father was a tobacconist on Long Wharf. West was born 3 months later, just outside of Philadelphia, on what is now the campus of Swarthmore College. His father was an innkeeper. Both Copley and West were painting professionally by their mid-teens. On the right is Copley's portrait of Mrs. Joseph Mann of 1753. On the left, West's portrait of Mrs. William Henry, painted several years later. Copley was certainly the faster one off the mark. At the age of 15, he painted a more accomplished portrait than West produced at the age of 17 or 18, which suggests that Copley had more manual or technical skill, but West certainly had other gifts which served him well in the long run. Although Copley quickly became well known in Boston, and West, as seen in this unpretentious miniature portrait at Yale, traveled as far north as New York to paint portraits, there's no evidence that they were aware of each other. In 1760, West was sent to Italy by several philanthropic Philadelphians to study the art of antiquity and the old masters, in the expectation that he would train himself as an artist and then return to Philadelphia to elevate the arts and culture of his homeland. But West never came back, settled in England for the rest of his life after spending 3 years or a little more in Italy. Now, while West traveled abroad, Copley remained in Boston and flourished. And by 1765, he knew that he was the best painter in New England and perhaps even in America. But what he didn't know was how his paintings compared to the works of European artists, especially his English contemporaries, but these works of modern and old masters about whom he had read or heard but had never seen. Acting out of a mix of curiosity and ambition, he painted this portrait of his half-brother Henry Pelham, the well-known boy with a squirrel, and sent it to London with a ship captain for exhibition at the Society of Artists the following year. Shortly after that, Copley was visited in Boston by an aspiring artist seeking advice, Charles Willson Peale of Annapolis. A portrait of Joshua Carter, which Peale painted in Newburyport a few months earlier, indicates the wide gulf in artistic ability that then existed between the 2 artists. Although Copley was only slightly older than Peale, he had been painting for almost a dozen years, while Peale had pursued a variety of other crafts and was still a novice at painting. Copley lent Peale a head painted by candlelight to copy, probably this earlier portrait of Henry Pelham. Although Peale, while in Boston, could hardly have looked at Copley's impressive paintings of 1765, such as Mrs. Theodore Atkinson, without a sense of his own inadequacy, they might also have inspired in him a desire someday to compete with Copley. Meanwhile, Copley's Boy with a Squirrel had been delivered to the attention of the English artist Joshua Reynolds, who sent it on to the exhibition. Word came back through the ship captain that Reynolds thought that, quote, it was a wonderful performance, and he encouraged Copley to come to Europe where he could see examples of great art and receive instruction, quote, before your manner and taste were corrupted or fixed by working in your little way at Boston. Copley's painting was not the only picture by an American artist exhibited at the Society of Artists in 1766. Matthew Pratt, a young Philadelphian studying with West, exhibited the painting known as The American School. It shows West on the left in his studio instructing young artists. Now, the unexpected appearance at the exhibition of Copley's Boy with a Squirrel caught West's attention. He wrote to Copley, introducing himself by saying, quote, I'm from America and know the little opportunities to be had there in the way of painting. West knew that what Copley wanted, or would want, was an objective, professional critique of the painting. Like Reynolds, he said it was a remarkable achievement for a young artist in America, but that there were a few shortcomings. He stressed primarily that the picture suffered from what he called lininess, meaning that the things depicted in the picture were too flat, with hard edges, and did not partake of the roundness that is the character of things in the physical world. But he added that Copley was so far advanced in his art, quote, that nothing is wanting to perfect you now but a sight of what has been done by the great masters. And if you could make a visit to Europe for this purpose for 3 or 4 years, you would find yourself then in possession of what will be highly valuable. If ever you should make a visit to Europe, you may depend on my friendship in any way that's in my power to serve. And then for the moment, West urged Copley to take his criticisms into consideration and send another portrait to his care for the exhibition the following year. Taking West's advice, Copley sent this portrait of a young lady with bird and dog for the 1767 exhibition. It was less well received. West, tactful as always, tried to cushion the blow, saying, first, before the criticisms, quote, these are criticisms I would not make were not your pictures very nigh upon a footing with the first artists who now paint, and my being sensible that observations of this nature in a friendly way to a man of your talents must not be disagreeable. He noted that Reynolds, quote, was not so much pleased with it as he was with the first picture you exhibited. Among other things, Copley had committed the cardinal sin in portraiture of cluttering the picture with peripheral items that competed with what should be the central focus of any portrait, that is, the head. The drapery, the chair, the parrot, the ribbon, the dog, the ornate rug, the curtain, the landscape, all of these distract attention from the primary subject. Copley realized now, getting the letter, that it was not going to be possible to improve his art on the basis of written advice. If he wanted to learn what West and Reynolds had to teach him, he was going to have to go to England. But he wasn't about to give up a flourishing and profitable business. Meanwhile, Charles Willson Peale, let me see where I am here, having returned to Maryland from his visit with Copley, was sent to London to study with West by a group of patrons acting with the same high-mindedness and motivation as the Philadelphians who had sent West abroad earlier. Peale became West's pupil and a very close friend, and West painted this portrait of him at some point during Peale's 2 years in London. Peale was in West's studio when Copley's Young Lady with a Bird and Dog arrived and certainly saw it. The following year, 1768, he exhibited at the Society of Artists a portrait of a girl, which Charles Coleman Sellers suggested was this 1768 painting. It seems specifically intended to rival Copley with such compositional similarities as a child standing on a patterned rug in front of a chair on which there is a plaything, holding a string in her left hand. It seems to me significant that Peale chose to compete not with his English contemporaries nor with his mentor, West, but with the leading artist in America, Copley. While he was in London, Peale received a commission from Maryland patrons to paint a portrait of William Pitt, supporter of the American colonies, from which Peale also produced a mezzotint engraving. His full length of Pitt was an ambitious undertaking, depicting the figure as a Roman consul holding the Magna Carta. Defending the claims of the American colonies on the basis of the British Constitution, Pitt points to a statue of British liberty, trampling underfoot a petition from the Congress at New York, a petition that had been rejected by the House of Commons. When Peale returned to America in 1769, the best artist in the colonies was still Copley, now at the zenith of his American career. But Peale, with 2 years of study and practice in London under his belt, had reason to believe that he was ready to compete with Copley, who had not been to Europe. Copley stood simultaneously as a formidable rival, but also as an example of what a successful artist could hope to achieve in America. Despite his English training, Peale's 1769 full-length of John Beale Bordley, here in the National Gallery, seems awkward in contrast with Copley's more elegant and assured Jeremiah Lee of the same year. Peale sent a copy of his Metzingen engraving of William Pitt to Copley. It may have been a thoughtful gesture of thanks to the artist who had encouraged him earlier, but I'm more inclined to think it was a shot across Copley's bow, informing him that now he had in America a competitor who had the advantage of 2 years of study in England. Copley thanked Peale for the print, saying that he wished he could see the painting from which it had been taken. If imitation is the sincerest form of flattery, Copley subsequently paid Peale an even greater compliment in his portrait of Samuel Adams, which seems to owe something in spirit and iconography, a patriot speaking out for principle and referring to a document asserting citizens' rights, if not in composition to Peale's Pitt. In 1769, the year that Peale returned from England, Copley, seen here in a self-portrait pastel of that year, began to acquire a 20-acre estate atop Beacon Hill next to John Hancock's house. Here's the Beacon. And in November, he married Susanna Clark, the daughter of a Boston agent of the British East India Company. This pair of pastel portraits at Winterthur celebrates their marriage. Shortly thereafter, rising expenses associated with refurbishing the new house coincided with a tapering off of portrait commissions in politically troubled Boston. And in June 1771, Copley, accompanied by his wife, traveled to New York for 6 months to paint portraits there. Copley, while he was in Boston, had been too far away for Peale in Annapolis to consider him a significant competitor. But now Copley was a real threat as he skimmed off the cream of the patronage in New York, painting members of wealthy Tory merchant families and of the British military establishment. Conversely, Copley also probably became aware of Peale as a rival while he was in New York. Although we do not know what paintings by Peale Copley actually saw in New York, that he had reason to feel confident that his portraits were as good or better than Peale's is suggested by this comparison of the first portrait he painted in New York, on the right, Mrs. Thomas Gage, with Peale's contemporaneous portrait of Mrs. Charles Carroll. Copley wrote to Henry Pelham from New York, quote, "I have done some of my best portraits here, particularly Mrs. Gage's. It is, I think, beyond compare the best lady's portrait I ever drew, but Mr. Pratt," that's Matthew Pratt, who painted the American School that we saw earlier, Mr. Pratt says of it, "It will be flesh and blood these 200 years to come, that every part and line in it is beautiful, that I must get my ideas from heaven." In August, Peale wrote from Annapolis to his patron, John Beale Bordley, who we saw earlier, "Mr. Copley of Boston, I hear, is now painting at New York. This is the time I ought to go to Philadelphia, but cannot before I have painted Mr. Johnson's and Mr. Hall's family." With its display of affection and intimacy, Peale's portrait of the Thomas Johnson family, to which he had referred in that letter to Bordley, is representative of other double and group portraits of this period. Although Copley could not have seen this particular Peale painting on his trip to New York, and later on that same trip, on a very short sojourn down to Philadelphia in the fall of 1771, he undoubtedly saw and heard something. The following year, writing to Boydley again from Philadelphia, Peale boasted, quote, "My reputation is greatly increased by a number of New Yorkers having been here, who have given me the character of being the best painter of America, that I paint more certain and handsomer likenesses than Copley. What more could I wish?" With his original group portraits, like the Johnson family, Peale had indeed become a force to be reckoned with. What apparently struck Copley about Peale's work was not so much its merits as the fact that Peale had successfully accomplished something that he himself had not attempted since his earliest juvenile pictures. Peale was producing multi-figure compositions, and Copley seems to have been stung by the challenge. Thus, when Mr. and Mrs. Thomas Mifflin of Philadelphia came to Boston in 1773 and commissioned their portraits, Copley, who had been painting only single-figure portraits, was prompted to tackle the more complicated compositional problems of a double portrait, especially in one that would find its way back to Philadelphia, where Peale might well see it. The following year, he came even closer to Peale in capturing the affinity between the figures in his portrait of Mr. and Mrs. Isaac Winslow. Copley's double portraits constituted a sophisticated artistic response to Peale, but the images of the radical Mifflin and the Tory Winslows also reflect the political disruption that caused him to leave America in 1774. His clientele was increasingly divided between radical and loyalist sitters, and taking a political stance would cost him dearly in commissions. So Copley used the non-political excuse of a need to study abroad, as West and Reynolds had urged, to remove himself from an awkward situation. He sailed for England, but the work he left behind inspired several younger artists. The one most deeply influenced by Copley was John Trumbull. As a young man, Trumbull had wanted to be a painter, but his father, the governor of Connecticut, who had loftier aspirations for him, disapproved and sent his son to Harvard. Arriving in Cambridge in 1772, Trumbull promptly crossed the river to Boston to see Copley, who had returned from New York. Trumbull later wrote, quote, "We found Mr. Copley dressed to receive a party of friends at dinner. I remember his dress and appearance, an elegant-looking man dressed in a fine maroon cloth with gilt buttons. This was dazzling to my unpracticed eye, but his paintings, the first I had ever seen deserving the name, riveted, absorbed my attention, and renewed all my desire to enter upon such a pursuit." The influence of these paintings by Copley on Trumbull is clear. Copley had painted his double portrait of Mr. and Mrs. Thomas Mifflin on the left, while Trumbull was at Harvard. Several years later, Trumbull, at the start of his own artistic career, painted this double portrait of his parents, Mr. and Mrs. Jonathan Trumbull, Sr., which in the pose of the two figures seated at a table and the background details of a shadowed niche and the freestanding column clearly reflects the influence of Copley's portrait of the Mifflins. It was also influenced in the background details and the informal men's robe and the turban by another portrait by Copley, the full-length portrait of Nicholas Boylston, painted in about 1772, the year of Trumbull's graduation from Harvard, which then hung in the philosophical chamber at the college. To some extent, Trumbull was also influenced here by Copley's Mr. and Mrs. Isaac Winslow, but reversing the composition. His portrait of his brother, Jonathan Trumbull, and his family is clearly modeled on Mr. and Mrs. Isaac Winslow, while the pose of Jonathan with his finger marking his place in a book seems taken from Thomas Mifflin's similar pose. In his self-portrait of 1777, Trumbull portrayed himself seated at a table with the tools of his trade spread out before him, a palette and brush, and a copy of Hogarth's Analysis of Beauty, an artist craftsman echoing Copley's portrait of Nathaniel Hurd, a silversmith engraver shown with his books, or another silversmith, Paul Revere. A second young artist, clearly aware of Copley before the Revolution, although he probably did not meet him, was Gilbert Stuart in Newport. Stewart's youthful double portrait of Francis Malbone and his brother Saunders not only reflects the compositional influence of Copley's double portraits of the Mifflins and Winslows seated behind and alongside of a table, but also in the pose of the boy on the right leaning on his elbow, employs a compositional device Copley frequently used in such late portraits as Paul Revere or Mrs. Humphrey Devereux. Copley arrived in England in 1774. He promptly called upon West, with whom he would have stayed were West not in the process of moving into a new studio on Newman Street, but the Wests invited Copley to dine with them whenever he was not otherwise engaged. West introduced Copley to Reynolds and took him to the Royal Academy, and together they visited the Royal Collection, where Copley first saw a version of West's great and influential painting of the death of General Wolfe. After 6 weeks in London, Copley set off for Italy by way of France in the company of an English artist, George Carter. The two did not get along well. Carter found Copley, here in a self-portrait painted a few years later, to be contentious and given to constant complaining. His unfriendly description of Copley was as, quote, very thin, pale, a little pockmarked, prominent eyebrows, small eyes, which after fatigue seemed a day's march in his head. Copley, in return, described Carter, quote, as a sort of snail which crawled over a man in his sleep and left its slime and no more. Copley was reunited with his family in London in October of 1775, and the following year painted the Copley family, a portrait here in the National Gallery upstairs. Here's Copley in the background. Here's his wife, Susanna Suki, his father-in-law, Richard Clark, his eldest daughter, Elizabeth, who's the only one who came back to America, his daughter, Mary, his son, John Singleton Copley, Jr., and the youngest at this time, daughter, Susanna. This painting may well have been inspired by a small family portrait now in the British Art Center at Yale that West had painted a few years earlier. West, in the background again, surveys his family on the left, his wife, Betsy, with their older son, Raphael, and a newborn son, Benjamin, Jr. Also present is West's Quaker family, his father, John West, who had earlier escorted Betsy, who was then West's fiancée from Philadelphia, and also West's English half-brother, Thomas. The West family and the Copley family were very close for a number of years, visiting and dining with each other. Copley admired and respected West and painted this portrait of him. His admiration for West soon led to emulation on a larger scale. While he painted portraits as necessary for income to support his family, Copley aspired to be a history painter, and he was keenly aware of West's innovations in this genre, notably the 1771 death of Wolfe. The painting celebrates such classical virtues as bravery and sacrifice for country, manifest in the heroic death of General Wolfe on the plains of Abraham in the French and Indian War a dozen years earlier, as a model for modern times. The traditional mode of representing heroes and heroic action was to put the figures in classical dress, as we saw in Peale's portrait of Pitt. By using contemporary dress, West increased the realism in order to heighten the immediacy of the message. This was a revolutionary move, and both George III and Reynolds strongly advised against it. West persisted, however, and with this one powerful painting created a radically new mode of modern history painting. When Copley exhibited his family picture at the Royal Academy in 1777, there wasn't much of a response to it. But the next year, 1778, Watson and the Shark, now also here in the National Gallery, was a big hit. People were fascinated then, as they still are, by this dramatic scene. The painting was commissioned by Brooke Watson, later Lord Mayor of London, who was a boy serving on a ship that was in Havana Harbor, went swimming and was attacked by a shark. Contemporary newspaper reviews related how the shark came in bit off the boy's foot, circled around, and snapped the flesh off one leg up to the knee, came in again and was closing in for the kill when Watson's shipmates arrived and rescued him at the last moment. The painting follows West's Wolfe in that it also is a scene that is recent in time with figures in contemporary dress, but the realism is carried a step further by the incorporation of information from maps and prints to realistically capture the convent towers, the cathedral, and Morro Castle at the right of the mouth of the harbor. In 1778, the year Copley painted and exhibited Watson and the Shark, West began to paint the death of the Earl of Chatham, recording in an oil sketch the moment when William Pitt, now Earl of Chatham, the subject of the earlier portrait and mezzotint by Peale, suffered a stroke while speaking in the House of Lords. West initially felt this would be a good subject, the death of an advocate of close ties between England and America. But with war having broken out, West, as an American who had become history painter to George III, dropped the project as impolitic and encouraged Copley to do it. Copley painted his large Death of Chatham between 1779 and 81. It deals with an event that was both contemporary in time and, unlike Wolfe or Watson, local in place. Copley exhibited the painting the following year in a large tent in Green Park, where 20,000 people came to see it over a 6-week period. Meanwhile, Copley's two American followers, Trumbull and Stuart, had come to London under separate and very different circumstances. Stuart, a loyalist, here in a later self-portrait, left America at the outbreak of hostilities and made his way to London, arriving there in September 1775. At first, he tried to make a go of it on his own, supplementing his meager income from portraiture as a church organist. Finally, after more than a year, he wrote in some desperation to West seeking assistance. West, always generous and accommodating, but also needing help in his studio, took Stuart on as a copyist. Stuart, who soon became West's #1 assistant, later said, quote, "I was welcomed with true benevolence, encouraged and taken into the family, and nothing could exceed the attentions of the artist to me. They were paternal." As for Trumbull, he joined the Revolutionary Army, even serving briefly as General Washington's aide-de-camp. Then, touchy and proud, Trumbull resigned his commission because he thought it was improperly dated, and in 1780, in the middle of the war, went to England by way of France to study painting with West, bearing a letter of introduction from Benjamin Franklin. According to Trumbull, West in the studio introduced him to Stuart, quote, "a young countryman of ours who is studying with me. He will show you where to find the necessary colors, tools, and so on." Irma Jaffe has written, quote, "Stuart and Trumbull formed a lasting friendship, surprising in view of their unlike natures. Stuart's personality was flamboyant. He was indifferent to social responsibilities, often drunk, and careless with money. Trumbull was reserved, proper, and meticulous about finances. Both were extravagant, however, and more often than not were in debt. They made good company together, playing duets on their flutes, for both enjoyed music, and discussing literature and painting. Stuart was constantly inventing wildly improbable anecdotes, which perfectly suited Trumbull's taste for joking. Trumbull recognized Stuart's genius and was drawn to his freedom of spirit." In later life, Stuart described West, their mentor, here in Stuart's 1785 portrait as, quote, "neat as a lad of wax, with his hair powdered, his white silk stockings and yellow Morocco slippers, looking as if he had stepped out of a bandbox." It was common for West to have his pupils and assistants serve as models. Stuart said that for West's Battle of the Boyne, he, quote, "had to lie on the floor for hours dressed in armor for him to paint me in the foreground of the picture as the Duke of Schomberg. Later, I had to sit for hours on a horse belonging to King George to represent King William." It is said that when West painted his installation of the Order of the Garter, begun while Stuart and Trumbull were pupils, the two young men, along with Mr. and Mrs. West, were posed in a group that appears in the upper left. Stuart was asked by West to paint West's portrait, and Stuart may have in fact painted the entire group. An interruption in this happy time occurred in the autumn of 1780 when Trumbull, a former American Army officer present in London, was seized in retribution for the arrest and execution of Major Andre as a British spy in New York in early October and thrown into jail. With his pupil in prison and facing an uncertain fate, West was aware of the awkwardness of his own position as history painter to the king. He immediately went to the king to voice his concern and was assured that although there would be no interference in the legal process, Trumbull's life would be spared. Stuart painted this portrait of Trumbull in jail, or at least he painted the head, probably with Trumbull finishing the rest of the picture himself. When Trumbull was arrested, a reporter wrote, quote, "He is a genteel-looking man, about 35 years of age." He was, in fact, 24 at the time, and rather of sallow complexion, appears to possess a clear and manly understanding, and conducted himself through the whole of this trying scene with a collected fortitude. Trumbull's stay in prison was reasonably comfortable. Rather than being confined to a cell, he rented a room from his prison keeper where he had meals brought in. West lent him a copy of Correggio's St. Jerome to copy and other art supplies. Eventually, Trumbull was released, with Copley and West each posting £100 to cover half of the bail, and sent back to America in June of 1781. Stuart, like Peale a decade earlier, had a very different professional orientation than Benjamin West. He wanted to paint portraits, not history. Although West, Copley, and Trumbull all painted portraits throughout their careers to make money or to gratify friends or relatives, their primary interest, conversely, was history painting. Peale and Stuart certainly learned much from West, especially about materials and techniques, but they paid particular attention to what the mainstream English portrait painters were doing. Stuart began to exhibit portraits at the Royal Academy in 1781, where this portrait of West was very well received, but his major splash occurred the following year when he exhibited The Skater, a portrait here in the National Gallery of a Scot in London, William Grant, a picture that subsequently disappeared from sight. When it reemerged and was exhibited at the Royal Academy almost a century later in 1878, the name of the artist had been forgotten, and the painting was attributed to Gainsborough, although some critics thought it was by Romney, others by Raeburn, evidence of the extent to which Stuart had absorbed the manner of his contemporary portraitists. In the wake of his success, Stuart left West's studio and struck out on his own, moving into an upscale house, getting married, and launching into a lifestyle that combined professional prosperity with personal extravagance. He entertained lavishly. He was described, quote, as at this time tall and strongly built, with a figure well fitted to display fine clothes, but pale-faced and rather sad in expression. In dress, quote, he emulated in style and costliness the leader of English fashion, the then Prince of Wales. All of this soon led Stuart into debt and a pattern of starting portraits in order to collect the down payment, but not finishing them. By 1787, he was forced to leave London, fleeing creditors, for Ireland, where the pattern repeated itself. 5 years later, in 1793, he skipped out of Ireland, leaving behind many unfinished portraits to recoup his fortune in America. Copley's next major history painting was The Death of Major Pearson, which he began while The Death of Chatham was being exhibited. Like Chatham, it is in the Tate Gallery in London. It again depicts a contemporary event, one that happened in January of 1781. A detachment of French Marines invaded the Channel Island of Jersey. They had almost captured the entire island when a 24-year-old British major, Francis Pearson, rallied the remaining local militia and British troops, launched a fierce counterattack, swept back into the capital city of St. Helier, and at the very moment of his triumph was shot by a French officer who in turn was killed by Pearson's black servant. The painting has a vigorous composition, brilliant color, and a lively flicker of light and dark contrasts across the surface. As in Watson and the Shark, the scene has a realistic setting. Here, the town square of St. Helier, with a statue of George II in the background and the hill behind Town Hall, and similarly features a black as a central figure. Like The Death of Chatham, it contains actual life portraits that Copley took of figures who are here gathered around a dying contemporary hero. When The Death of Pearson was exhibited in 1784, this portrait of Copley by Stuart, now in the National Portrait Gallery in London, was inset in the top center of the frame. In the wake of the Revolutionary War, West decided that it would be desirable to make a visual record of the great events that had transpired in America. But after further deliberation, he again decided, as history painter to the king, that scenes of the war, which culminated in Britain's defeat and loss of the American colonies, would not be appropriate for him as subject matter. Copley, who, like West, was now permanently established in England, felt the same way. They both encouraged Trumbull, who intended to pursue his career in America, to take on the project. After the war ended, Trumbull had returned to England to resume his study with West, taking up the senior position in the studio that Stuart had vacated. This is Trumbull's Battle of Bunker's Hill, done in West's studio in 1786, the first in a series of 8 Revolutionary War paintings that are at Yale. Copley's Death of Pearson was on public exhibition when Trumbull returned. He was clearly influenced by it as he developed his composition of Bunker's Hill. And I say Bunker's Hill because that's what Trumbull called it, not Bunker Hill. And so he was pretty insistent about that. The death group, the fleeing figures on the right, the diagonal movement and play of lights and darks are the similar. Working in West's studio, he was also influenced, of course, by West's Death of Wolfe. This was even more the case with his second picture, The Death of General Montgomery, with its similar subject of the death of a military hero in Quebec. When West had initially thought about painting scenes from the American Revolution, he wrote a letter to his former pupil, Charles Wilson Peale, in Philadelphia, requesting, quote, drawings or small paintings of the dresses of the American Army, from the officers down to the common soldier, rifleman, etc., and any other characteristic of their armies or camps from which I may form an exact idea to enable me to form a few pictures of the great events of the American contest. Peale replied several months later, describing, quote, the attire frontier riflemen would wear with powder horn and shot pouch of the Indian fashion, with wampum belts, small round hats, a buck's tail. I might keep an eye on this. And sometimes feathers. Very often these shirts were dyed brown, yellow, pink, and blue-black color, according to the fancies of the company. And Peale sent along a hunting shirt and leggings, and Trumbull apparently incorporated some of the costumes that Peale had sent to West in his picture. In 1783, the Corporation of the City of London offered a commission for a major painting for which both Copley and West competed to commemorate the siege and relief of Gibraltar. Combined Spanish and French forces had laid siege to Gibraltar in 1779. The British broke the siege in 1782 when an invading fleet of Spanish floating batteries was destroyed by artillery commanded by General Heathfield, and subsequently when a relief fleet under Admiral Howe arrived. West said that the subject would require 2 paintings, one for the breaking of the siege by General Heathfield, and another, a marine scene, for the relief of Gibraltar by Admiral Howe. Copley claimed that he could combine the 2 subjects in one picture, doing the job more cheaply and efficiently, and he won the commission. Copley originally intended to paint what we see in the left-hand part of the composition, with the British officers and artillery placed back in the distance. Heathfield and other officers who took part objected, wishing the heroes being honored to be more prominently placed. So Copley arrived at this bifurcated composition, which took him years to complete. When it was finally finished, the subject had become dated and the critical response was not favorable. During World War II, this painting of the Siege of Gibraltar, which is enormous, it's 18 by 25 feet, was rolled up and was put away in storage for 50 years. It's now been restored and splendidly installed at the Guildhall Museum in London. It is, in fact, a spectacular painting, and I encourage you, when you're in London, to go see it. You'll be surprised. Copley, obviously, did not fulfill his initial claim that he could combine the siege and the relief of Gibraltar in one picture. His solution was to incorporate a seascape. Here's the picture on exhibition, and here is a seascape by the English marine painter Dominic Serres as sort of a predella underneath the picture. That seascape no longer exists and is known only through an engraving. Despite the competition between West and Copley for the Gibraltar Commission, the two families continued their friendship. The Wests frequently entertained the Copleys, whose name appears in Mrs. West's account book more than anybody else's. Their friendship may have been especially important during the difficult year 1785, when two of the Copleys' children, Susanna and Jonathan, died of what was then called putrid sore throat, that is, diphtheria. In that year, West recommended Copley for a royal commission to paint the daughters of George III because, it has been said, Stuart, whom West would usually recommend for a portrait commission, quote, hated to paint children, did not like to paint groups, preferred to paint only head and shoulders portraits, sometimes refused to finish his portraits, and occasionally insulted his sitters. A portrait of three royal princesses was Copley's great opportunity to secure the royal patronage that he had never enjoyed. But when the picture was exhibited, it was ridiculed in a review written anonymously by another artist, John Hopner, who also had painted royal children's portraits and had his own agenda. But that review severely damaged Copley's reputation, and he never again received a royal commission, even though the Daughters of George III, which is still in the royal collection, is a wonderful, spirited painting. In the following year, 1786, West, still a little galled perhaps by having lost the Gibraltar Commission to Copley, encouraged Trumbull, who had now launched himself on the Revolutionary War series, to paint the same subject. Trumbull actually started to depict the Siege of Gibraltar, but tactfully decided this was not a good idea, and he shifted to a different scene from that engagement, a bold, nocturnal sortie by the British out from the fortifications at Gibraltar to attack the besieging troops by surprise. Trumbull's sortie from Gibraltar was completed in 1789 and exhibited at Spring Gardens. There was, however, not much public response, and subscriptions for a print were disappointing. In 1792, Sir Joshua Reynolds died, and West was elected to succeed him as president of the Royal Academy. Here, in a self-portrait, he sits in the president's chair with the Academy in the background. Copley was resentful, feeling that he was a better history painter and should have been made president. West, as history painter to the king, obviously had an important connection for what was, after all, the Royal Academy. He had always been generous in his teaching and encouragement of other artists and was generally well-liked. One of the most striking things about West was the control that he had over his emotions. He rarely lost his temper. He was always cool, undogmatic, never given to excess. Copley was much more sharp and acerbic, quite argumentative, often involved in litigation for one reason or another. He was something of a tightwad, had few friends outside of his family circle, and almost no pupils. West was also enormously self-assured. He annoyed some people, especially other artists, with his calm assumption that he was the best artist, disclaiming any personal credit by saying that God had given him a gift and he was simply using it. West was described by a contemporary as, quote, a genteel and generous man as long as he had the upper hand, a strong-willed personality, the friend of no one who might possibly interfere with his success. In 1800, Copley received a commission from Lord Knatchbull for a large family portrait seen here in an oil sketch. Copley, whom West had earlier characterized as the, quote, the most tedious of all painters, made slow progress. As time passed, Lord Knatchbull remarried and wanted his new wife introduced into the picture, along with children as they came along. When the picture was finally completed in 1803, Copley submitted a bill for 1,800 guineas. Knatchbull objected, offered 1,400, and was refused. Legal action ensued, and the case was referred to arbitration. Knatchbull said that it had been Copley's idea to place his former wives in the sky as angels. He only wanted their portraits in the background. West testified at the trial that the price Copley asked was exorbitant, that £1,200 would have been handsome and $1,400 princely. Eventually, the large picture was cut up into 3 smaller ones. While this was going on, Stuart, who had returned to America in 1793, prospered, painting prominent American sitters in New York, Philadelphia, and Washington. This is a late portrait of Stuart by John Nagel. Stuart settled in Boston, Copley's hometown, in 1803. In 1805, Trumbull, after a long period of diplomatic service in England, went to Boston to see about setting up there as a Boston painter. He received a cool reception because Stuart, who had a greater reputation, had already accepted an invitation to settle there. Trumbull therefore resumed painting in New York, primarily portraits. Trumbull and Stuart remained good friends. In later years, Trumbull called Stuart the greatest portrait painter of the age and one of the greatest of all time. When he was in Boston exhibiting the first of the 4 large versions of paintings from his Revolutionary War series that were placed in the rotunda of the Capitol building here in Washington, the Declaration of Independence, Trumbull had Stuart paint this portrait. Stuart, for his part, told the visiting young artist Matthew Jewett that he loved Trumbull and thought highly of his talents. In New York, Trumbull became president of the American Academy of Fine Arts. Unlike West or Peale, who had founded the first American Academy of Art, the Columbianum, in Philadelphia in 1794, and put on the first major art exhibition there the following year, Trumbull was not an effective leader of an institution for nurturing young artists. One biographer has written that, quote, as with many sensitive, defensive individuals, Trumbull often adopted a tone that made him appear arrogant or condescending. As for Peale, in late life he painted some of his most important works, including his self-portrait of the artist in his museum, which was located on the 2nd floor of Independence Hall in Philadelphia. Things were not always smooth for West in London. This is his self-portrait done in 1793, the year after he became president of the Royal Academy, with a statue of his prime patron, George III, behind him. He had troubles with the king, who lapsed into madness occasionally and became a difficult and eventually impossible patron. In 1807, there was a coup in the Royal Academy with Copley as the primary mover. West was voted out of the presidency, but the insurrection collapsed and West was reelected the following year, serving until he finally died in 1820 at the age of 82. There was a grand funeral procession and West was interred at St. Paul's. For Copley, the ending was very different, clouded by financial difficulties and diminishing artistic power. The artist Joseph Farrington, having seen Copley at the Academy, observed to West in 1811 that his appearance had changed greatly, quote, having a look of imbecility and a sort of absent, bewildered manner. Copley died in 1815, 5 years before West, at the age of 77. Copley's revenge, if you can call it that, was post-mortem. His brilliant lawyer's son, John Singleton Copley, Jr., here in a very poor slide of a late portrait by his father, was knighted and eventually elevated to a baronetcy as Lord Lyndhurst and served as Lord Chancellor under Queen Victoria. West's 2 sons, Raphael and Benjamin Jr., did not turn out very well, squandering a substantial inheritance and ending up in debt. Peale and Stuart, who continued into their final years as major and respected artists in Philadelphia and Boston, died a year apart in 1827 and 1828, respectively. Trumbull lived on in New Haven, where late in life he founded the Yale University Art Gallery. He was the last to die, aged 87, in 1843. And that concludes our somewhat breathless survey of the intersecting careers of 5 major American, or perhaps more accurately for all except Peale, Anglo-American artists. Thank you.
I think Professor Brown is prepared for a few questions, if anybody would like to raise a hand.
Yep.
There is a Gilbert Stuart house or mill in Rhode Island. Is that where Stuart was born?
Yes. It was a snuff mill. His father ran a snuff mill. Yes.
When did he leave?
When did Stuart leave America?
Now, when did he leave Rhode Island? When he got old enough to know better?
No, when the war broke out. He went to Nova Scotia and then on. It was the Scottish family, and they went to Nova Scotia and then on to England.
I see a hand all the way at the back.
Yes.
You could shout very loudly.
Museum, you say, was in London, where the Copley painting?
The Guildhall Museum near St. Paul. Guildhall. It's the museum of the City of London, and it's near St. Paul's. And it really is. When I wrote my book on Copley, I only read the literature on that picture and worked from black and white photographs of it, and I didn't think it was very good because of that funny divided composition, and was just bowled over by seeing the picture as it's been restored and reinstalled. It's a great painting, really. I think there was one over here.
Yes.
Yeah.
What were the patronage circumstances of the revolutionary paintings? Were they made for particular clients, or
No.
just with the hope that someone would buy them?
Well, always the hope of somebody would buy them. No, they all had multiple ways of making money from these pictures that were done on speculation, and they were disposed of in various ways. The primary reason for Trumbull and where he expected to make his most money was through engravings. So much of his time was spent in arranging for the engravers, to get the best engravers to do the paintings. And making a steel plate engraving was a very time-consuming and difficult process, and he got several engravers involved on it, and then eventually he had to leave England before it was completed, and he had West sort of as his agent to look after the project and see it through to its completion. He also hoped to sell them to to convince the federal government to make these big versions, and was in the long run successful in getting four out of the 8 done for the rotunda. The death of Pearson, for example, Copley hoped that somebody would buy it, and eventually it was put up for a raffle and was sort of won on a raffle. That was the way. When it was exhibited, you saw the slide of it being exhibited. People who would go to the exhibition would pay their admission, but they also could subscribe to an engraving in which you put down half of the amount in advance and then would pay the rest of it when it was completed a few years down the road. So there are lots of different ways that they would make their money. Yeah. Yeah.
There was an unfinished painting of the Treaty of Paris in the State Department. Could you talk about that? What wasn't finished?
Well, as I recall, I guess the first version of that picture is at Winterthur, and the sitters were, the American delegation was Franklin, Jay, Franklin's son. Who else was there? Adams, John Adams. And Lawrence, Henry Lawrence, all of whom were multiple. Those were the people who were multiply painted by Stuart, by Copley, and so on. So anyway, Stuart painted the American delegation for the Treaty of Paris, but the British delegation never sat, so the picture was never finished. And the unfinished one is at Winterthur, and the State Department one I'm not familiar. Must be a second version. A copy? Is that right?
Cadmium red.
Oh,
Cadmium red.
Oh, okay. She said it is a copy because it has cadmium red, which would have been a pigment that was invented much later than the lifetime of Stuart. So it must be a copy. Yeah. I think there was a question back here first, or was that no? Yeah.
Was Copley considered the best portraitist among the group there?
No. Well, it depends when, I suppose. Pick a year.
early one?
We see Stuart is really the next generation. And so, I mean, this is really a very interesting question because Copley, Copley is certainly the best portrait painter during the colonial period. And then he leaves. Then Stuart comes back in the 1790s and brings with him effectively an English portrait style. So it's completely different than what Copley was doing earlier. And in a sense, it obliterates the tradition that Copley had started. So during the colonial period, certainly Copley, after the Revolution, Stuart. And it's ironic because Stuart then settles eventually in Boston. Copley had thought about coming back to America, where he would have resumed his career in America. His son, Lord Lyndhurst, whose portrait you saw, was a very conservative man, always told his father he ought to go back, and called him a rank Jacobin. He thought he was a real radical. But Mrs. Copley wouldn't come back, and the daughter wouldn't, the younger daughter wouldn't come back. So he stayed in England. But it would have been interesting if Copley had come back, that the whole history of American painting would be different. Yeah.
I wonder how these artists are received in England now. Are they considered British artists? And were you to give this talk at the National Gallery in London, do you think you know such an audience?
No. The English certainly do consider West and Copley to the extent to the pictures. I mean, like the Death of Chatham, Death of Pearson, which are in the Tate Gallery, as English painters by English artists, and in the case of the Peale certainly is an American artist. Trumbull and Stuart did some important work in England, but I don't think they would be considered by the English as English artists. So I think it's West. They would certainly claim West, second president of the Royal Academy, and Copley painted for 22 years in America, 40 years in England. So they probably, at least quantitatively, have a claim. But in our slide room, all of the slides of West and Copley are under America. So, that's what, yeah. Your slide room is probably the same thing. Okay.
Well, I want to say thank you so much for starting our new series with such an outstanding presentation. Thank you very, very much, Joe. Thank you.